Hey everyone, this is Peter with Roland. We're going to take a look at how to sequence gear like the SH01A and SCO2 with the TR-8S. Now, the TR-8S has a dedicated trigger output on the back that lets you connect patch cables to gear like the SCO2 or the SH01A, anything that has a trigger input or external clock input. And it uses voltage to control those, meaning that every time I have a note on the sequence of the TR-8S, it sends out a pulse to trigger the sequencer of the attached piece of gear. Now, what's cool about the TR-8S is that it has not only a trigger output, but you have audio outputs as well that can be configured to be trigger outputs. So I can control a bunch of different gear at once, not just one. So in this case, I have the trigger output connected to the SCO2 and the SH01A connected to the first assignable output. Now let's take a look at how to set up one of the tracks on the TR-8S to control the SH01A. We're going to use the rim shot for this example, and I'm just going to clear out the notes here, and let's take a listen to the pattern. So the first thing that you want to do is press utility and navigate to where it says assign out 1, and we want to make sure that's set to trigger because we're telling the assignable output 1 that it's going to set to trigger mode, so it'll send a trigger every time an instrument has a note on its sequence. The second thing that we want to do is hold shift and hit kit and go to where it says output, and we want to select rim shot and make sure it's set to assign 1 because we're telling that the TR-8S that the rim shot is the track that's going to go out the first assignable output. So at this stage we want to put in some notes. And you'll notice that it's not only sending a trigger output, you can also hear the sound of the rim shot out the mix output. And that's because in the old days, when you had a TR-808 and you wanted to synchronize something as a trigger, you would have to go out of the rim shot and directly into the piece of gear, and that would basically sacrifice that instrument sound to act as a trigger. So the TR-8S lets you have both. But if you don't want that, if you'd rather just have the rim shot track act as just a sequencing track with no sound, it's an easy fix. What I like to do is hold shift, hit control select, go to the gain page all the way to the right, and then just turn the rim shot all the way down. Now, every time there is a note on the rim shot track, you can hear the SH01A is triggered. So from here, we can actually look at the silk screening of the instrument buttons here and see the trigger output happens when I press these two at the same time, and I can see that this is a dedicated trigger output track that's going to the SCO2. So if every time I input a note, it'll send a trigger to the SCO2 sequencer telling it to advance a step. And the SCO2 sequencer is pretty cool because I could switch the playback mode to random, so it'll get some more kind of improvised random playback of those notes. It's not necessarily the same order. Because the triggers are coming from the TR-8S, I can use the advanced sequencer of the TR-8S to do some creative types of sequence manipulation. For example, if I go to the rim shot track that's controlling the SH01A, I can use substeps and get that kind of fast repetition happening that's controlling the SH01A sequencer. And I can even hold last step and say, okay, I want the rim shot track to be only 3 steps long when the rest of the kit is playing at an even phrasing. So I get this really cool out of phase loop type of thing. So the TR-8S is the only thing that I'm controlling when it comes to timing the sequencers of the SCO2 and the SH01A. It has a lot of power on its own, so I get some really great results just by using the TR-8S and leaving the SH01A and SCO2 alone. But if I want to control the sequencers with the TR-8S and start to manipulate the sound of each of these attached pieces of gear, that's when it gets to be a really compelling performance. And the method of controlling the sequencers with triggers is a very traditional method, but it's also really fun, and that's when you get some really interesting variety for the performances that you're doing.